Hello everyone. Today I'm going to respond to one of the most common objections that's been raised against the notion of an omnipotent, all-powerful being. The objection is presented in the form of a question, which allegedly results in a dilemma regarding the notion of an omnipotent being. Here's the question. Can God, an omnipotent being, create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? The alleged dilemma that results from this is if the answer is yes, then there's something that God, an omnipotent being, can't do. Namely, lift a rock that he created because it's too heavy for him to lift. However, if the answer is no, then there's still something that he can't do. Namely, create a rock that's too heavy for him to lift. So either way you go, there's something that he can't do, which of course proves that he can't be omnipotent, right? Well, not so fast. There's actually a lot of problems with this alleged dilemma. I keep saying alleged because there really isn't a dilemma at all, and I'm going to explain why. What we really have here is a false dilemma that is based on an extremely fallacious and completely nonsensical question, to put it a little bluntly. One reason the question, can God create a rock so heavy that he himself can't lift, is fallacious is because the question presupposes that God not being able to do something necessarily means that he can't be omnipotent. But such a conclusion is based either on a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of what omnipotence actually means. God being all-powerful does in fact mean that he can do anything. But that's anything as in anything. But of course, logical contradictions like square circles, married bachelors, or one-ended sticks are not really things. They don't have being in any sense, which is to say that they're not existable. These examples are nothing more than incoherent concepts because they violate the law of non-contradiction. They are logically and metaphysically impossible. They are logically impossible because we can't conceive of them. Obviously, no one can actually conceptualize of what it would mean for a married bachelor to exist, because a bachelor must necessarily be unmarried. They are metaphysically impossible because they are intrinsically impossible, which means that their constitutive elements are incompatible. From a metaphysical standpoint, it's clearly impossible to constitute elements that cancel each other out. A married bachelor is obviously an example of this because a man can't be married and unmarried at the same time. The married element cancels out the unmarried element and vice versa. So they can't be constituted. I say all of this to make the very strong point that God's omnipotence is defined in accordance with what is both logically and metaphysically possible, as well as consistent with his nature. Therefore, omnipotence is actually defined as God being able to do anything that is logically and metaphysically possible and consistent with his nature. In this video, however, I'm going to focus on the logical and metaphysical aspects since the proposed dilemma relates to those aspects of omnipotence. In order for something to be truly possible, it must be both intrinsically possible and extrinsically possible. Intrinsic possibility refers to the constitutive elements of a possible thing being compatible. Extrinsic possibility refers to there being a cause powerful enough to impart existence to a possible thing that has compatible constitutive elements. God's causal power is always sufficient, but if the constitutive elements of a so-called thing are not compatible but cancel each other out, then it's not possible in any sense for that so-called thing to be created. But as you can see, this fact is not at all due to God lacking power, for he doesn't lack any power. The fact follows from the nature of metaphysical reality itself, which of course flows from God's nature, because he is the ultimate reality and grounds what is intrinsically and extrinsically possible. Now that I've provided a fair amount of background knowledge, let me return to the so-called rock dilemma regarding omnipotence. The dilemma is supposed to reason from the point of God being omnipotent to the conclusion that the idea of God being omnipotent is paradoxical. So the dilemma doesn't start with the premise that omnipotence is absurd, but rather allegedly reaches the conclusion that omnipotence is absurd. Okay, let's go through and see if the premise that God is all-powerful leads to a paradox as laid out by the dilemma. We start with the premise that God is all-powerful. What follows logically and necessarily from this is that there's no power that is separate from God. He possesses all of it. There is no such thing or possibility of any power being distinguished or divorced from his power, since he possesses all power. So then, would it be possible for God to oppose himself in some way with his own power? Could he defeat himself in some way with his own power? Obviously not, because he has all the power that there is, and it can't be divorced from him. All of this follows from the premise that God is omnipotent. So, with the rock example, we're presented with two options. Either God creates a rock so heavy that he can't lift it, which implies a limitation, or he can't create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it, which also allegedly implies a limitation. The first option is truly absurd because it doesn't make any sense in the first place to ask if an all-powerful being can create something with his all-power that would surpass his all-power. Do you see the problem? According to the principle of proportionate causality, whatever is in an effect must in some way be in its total cause. What follows from this is whatever an effect has, it got from its cause. And of course, a cause can only give what it has. It can't give more than it has. Such an idea is logically absurd and metaphysically impossible. And what God has is all power. So if God were to create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it, the rock would have to exceed his power, which is all power. Obviously, that's not possible, because there's no power beyond all power. Therefore, the very question, can God, who is all-powerful, create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it, is absurd, disingenuous, and based on completely fallacious reasoning. It doesn't make any sense to ask such a question. It's like asking, can a married bachelor exist? So the first part of the dilemma can be rightly dismissed, since it is incoherent. But what about the second part of the dilemma? If the answer is no, that God can't create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it, does it follow from that he's not omnipotent? No, it does not. 2 points about this. Number one, omnipotence isn't defined as God being able to do anything, as in so-called things that don't correspond to reality, logically or metaphysically, or things that are inconsistent with God's nature. God not being able to create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it rightly follows from him being omnipotent. He has all power. And like I mentioned earlier, it's absurd in the first place to ask if God can create a rock so heavy he can't lift it, because such a rock would have to exceed his own power, which would mean God himself would have to exceed his own power in creating the rock, which is logically incoherent as well as metaphysically impossible, since a cause can't exceed or give more than it has, and obviously there's no power beyond all power. What follows logically and necessarily from this is that no, God cannot create a rock so heavy that he himself can't lift it. But such a conclusion does not at all contradict God's being omnipotent, but rather it follows necessarily from his omnipotence. So this objection fails on all fronts. It doesn't at all prove that the idea of God being omnipotent is absurd, but rather the objection itself is absurd. God not being able to create a rock too heavy for him to lift makes complete sense with the notion of his omnipotence, since omnipotence is properly defined as God being able to do anything that is logically and metaphysically possible, as well as consistent with his nature. There is no such thing as absurdities being created at all, since absurdities are not possible or actual things because they don't have the capacity to exist in the first place. They don't possess being. There's also no such thing as an all-powerful being producing something more powerful than himself, since he possesses all power. And for the record, There's also no such thing as a morally perfect being committing sin, since it would contradict his nature, which is something I'll hopefully be able to expound upon in another video. In this video, I just wanted to address the logical and metaphysical aspects that pertain to omnipotence, properly defined in response to the rock dilemma. Well guys, that's it for this video. So as always, let me know what you think, and please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you.